to give us a view from afar. It's now our great privilege to welcome the economics Nobel laureate, Paul Krugman, to Rising India. Mr. Krugman won the ultimate prize back in 2008 for his work in economic geography and identifying international trade patterns. He's written more than 20 books, 200 papers in professional journals. The notable ones being the essay collection, The Great Unraveling, Losing Our Way in the New Century, which was published in 2003. At that time, it criticized the then administration of President George W. Bush. He's written numerous economics textbooks like microeconomics and macroeconomics. Back in 1991, he won the John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded to economists under the age of 40. And I'd like to remind our viewers that following Mr. Krugman's speech, we'll have a question-answer session moderated by CNBC TV 18's executive editor, Lata Venkatesh. So it's my real pleasure to welcome Paul Krugman to Rising India.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Network 18 for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. And okay, I'm going to try to keep a little track of time here. I'm not an expert on India. That I hope will be clear. I do have a fair bit to say about India in the context of the world economy, but I want to start by talking about some more global issues, and then focus in on where India fits into the story. And I actually thought that it would be interesting, perhaps, to give you a little bit of a personal retrospective. That may seem a little odd here, but I think it's relevant. So I went to graduate school in the 1970s. I got my PhD in that decade. And at that point in one's life, you need to decide what your specialty is going to be, what area is going to be the piece of economics that you're going to focus on. And it was clear to me that from the point of view of serving humanity, what I really should work on was development economics. There was no issue more important to the world, still is no issue more important to the world than the question of how to help poorer countries become less poor. And I didn't do it because I was a coward, because in the 1970s, development economics was a deeply depressing field. In the 1970s, development economics was mostly non-development economics. It was about the question of why poor countries didn't seem to be able to get richer, why there didn't seem to be any convergence, why the division of the world between wealthy nations and poor nations seemed to have stabilized, seemed to have frozen, and there was really no progress in closing that gap, why countries were not making their way up. In other words, it was a very, very different world from the one that we live in today, which is a world in which we have seen extraordinary development successes in a number of countries, very, very much, of course, including this one. That success, the first inklings of that change were starting to be visible by the late 1970s. The OECD first introduced the concept of newly industrializing economies around 1978. But at that time, they meant small East Asian economies. They meant South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. And many skeptics, I'm sorry to say, including myself, said, well, all right, that model might work for a small country with a few million people, but it couldn't possibly succeed if we tried to expand it to China or India. But of course, everything has changed. Now, when I talk about how development economics was a depressing subject, was about failure to develop, the case in point, perhaps the most visible case, was in fact India. For about 35 years after independence, India was extraordinarily disappointing. Not a disaster. It grew slightly richer. Per capita income grew around 1% a year over that period. So India was a little bit richer by the 1980s than it had been at the time of independence, but not a lot. And the gap between India and the world's wealthiest nations grew wider, not narrower. At the beginning of that period, India's per capita GDP was about 6% that of the United States. By the end, it was down to around 4.5%. So in fact, from the point of view of the world stage, India was falling behind, not making progress. And then everything changed. Somewhere in the 1980s, the whole world, the whole pattern of world growth, of world development changed. And it changed in two ways which have to be related. One of them was that globalization took if I can borrow a phrase from another emerging nation, a great leap forward. Something unprecedented began to happen to the world trading system. If we look at, now it's true that trade had been growing rapidly, faster than income ever since World War II. That we'd had a long period of growing trade, but until around 1985 or so, all of that growth in trade simply reflected a return to old patterns. As late as about 1985, world trade relative to world GDP was only about as high as it had been in 1913. That is, we were only restoring to roughly back to where we had been before World War I. And in between, of course, we had two wars, a Great Depression, widespread protectionism, and then gradual liberalization of trade after that. But all of that had been only enough to more or less restore the amount of globalization of trade that we'd had before. And in fact, in other respects, international investment was actually lower than it had been before World War I. International movement of people was lower than it had been before World War I. So as of 1980, it was easy to say, look, we're not a very global economy. We're more than we were in 1950, but really nothing that our grandfathers wouldn't have seen as being perfectly normal. Since then, something changed. Since then, we've seen a takeoff of international trade and other forms of globalization to levels that really are unprecedented. In particular, after 1990, you just see this inflection point in which world trade begins to grow much more rapidly than it had in the past, to levels about twice anything that we had seen before. Not only did the volume of international trade grow, but the character changed as well. In the 1980s, we were still overwhelmingly a world in which wealthy countries sold manufactured goods to developing countries, and developing countries sold raw materials in return. It was, to the extent that there was an industry in developing countries, it was industry aimed at the domestic market, industry that grew up behind high tariffs and other barriers to international trade. So it was still very much, it was, if you like, it was, in economic terms, it was a colonial world still. Maybe the colonies had political independence, but in terms of their economic role, they were hewers and wood and drawers of water for the advanced countries still. All of that changed. We became a world in which sophisticated, well, certainly manufactured goods, not necessarily sophisticated ones, became major exports of developing countries. Complete transformation in the pattern of trade. A change in the nature of that trade as well, in that simple trade, a manufactured good from Britain traded for jute from from South Asia, was replaced with a world in which a product would be produced in many stages in different countries, in which the value added. You know, the famous example these days is smartphones. You know, where is a smartphone manufactured? And the answer is, well, that's actually a complicated question. Something like this is it includes probably a microprocessor from Japan, a memory chip from Korea, a disk drive from Singapore, and the final assembly will have taken place in China. But calling it a Chinese product is very much misleading about the nature of the actual process. What led to this tremendous increase in trade? Well, we don't fully actually understand it. One of the things you learn when you start to study economic history seriously is that often we don't fully really understand what causes changes. One of my old teachers used to say that attempts to explain economic growth always end up in a blaze of amateur sociology. So there's always some things that we don't fully understand. But there were a couple of things that played an important role, and I want to stress those because they will eventually be part of my story of why India may be a little bit different from other emerging economies. So one thing was technologies of transportation and communication. Containerization was widely introduced in the 1970s, but it took a while to figure out what you could do with it. And so at a certain point, it became possible to the important thing about containerized freight is not that it's cheaper to ship, but it's cheaper to get on and off the ships and onto other modes of transport, which means that a multi-stage production process becomes much, much easier to do. Makes it possible to do this thing where a product is produced in a series of stages, geographically very distant. And information technology makes it possible to keep track of that kind of complicated transaction, to coordinate production operations globally. So it's certainly the case that improved technology made it possible to have a much more integrated global economy. And there were also big policy changes, not so much in advanced countries. Wealthy countries had already pretty much, they'd already brought tariffs down to quite low levels by 1980. When we talk about trade policy, the really big changes there took place in the 1950s and 1960s, and in advanced countries they had already taken place. But emerging markets made a huge, almost a U-turn on policy. Before the 1980s, the overwhelming thrust of policy was towards manufacturing for the domestic market. And no place more than here. India tried as closely as possible to be a self-sufficient, completely inward-looking economy, trade only about 4% of GDP. It was a wholly inward-looking model of development, which didn't work. After the 1980s, there was a huge shift towards trade liberalization, opening up of exports, very enormous outward. And of course, in the case of China, the end of communism as a fact, if not as the end of communism as an ideology, and the shift to a more or less market economy. So between those two things, you have this enormous increase in world trade. What happens more or less at the same time, and must be closely related, is a transformation in the pattern of world development. And I don't know if you've heard of Branko Milanovic, now my colleague at the City University of New York, and the elephant curve. But if you haven't, you should. What Branko has done is to create a picture of incomes around the world, not by country, but by person. Let's just look at the global distribution of income. Line up all of the people in the world as best we can by their income and ask, how is that income changing? How has income changed if we look at the 10th percentile, the 50th percentile, the 90th percentile of the global income distribution? And what he finds is that since the late 1980s, if we put on one axis the percentile of the income distribution, and on the other axis the growth rate of income, what you get is a curve that looks like that. Whoops, there. He says elephant. I think that this part is supposed to be the trunk of the elephant. There's this huge hump in the middle, and then the big rise. Now, what we're seeing here is that the poorest countries, the poorest people who are in the poorest countries, have still seen very little improvement. Most of sub-Saharan Africa is still pretty much where it was. We also see there's another dip in there, which is the working class in the advanced countries, which has not seen very much income growth. And that's part of the story of political economy in the first world, resentment, populism, some very strange people achieving elected office, but I'm taking a vacation from that for now. And at the far end, there is a global elite which has been pulling away from everybody else. And that's a problem that some of us spend a lot of time worrying about, but it's really not my subject here. But what there is in that middle, that big hump, is the rise of the middle class in emerging markets. That is the dramatic rise of income in a number of countries that were very poor, are still relatively poor compared with Western Europe or the United States, but not nearly so relatively poor as they used to be. And they have achieved extraordinary growth in income over that period. People mostly, when they talk about this story, understandably focus on China, where you have the most dramatic changes. But India is very, very much part of that story as well. And I think, when I was asked to speak to this conference, people wanted me to talk a little bit about how the rest of the world sees India. And the truth is that the rest of the world does not actually pay nearly as much attention to India as it should. If you were to look at the Indian story, suppose that China were not in the picture, getting so much of the focus and, of course, also so much of the hostility. Suppose we only looked at India, then we would be saying, what an incredible story, something that was really unprecedented in global economic history. What we've seen since India really made a turnaround about 30 years ago, we've seen a quadrupling of GDP per capita. That's transformational. That's huge. We've seen now India go. Now it has now converged significantly on advanced countries. It's still poor, but not in the same level at all. If we were to say, best measure says that Indian GDP per capita is about 12% of the U.S. level right now, which sounds low because it is, but that's way up from 4%, which is where it was not that long ago. And if you want some comparators, as best, the economic numbers like this are always abstractions that don't at all really capture the richness of life. But for what it's worth, India right now appears to have about the same per capita income as Japan did in 1960, or about the same per capita income that South Korea had in 1980. And of course, we know what happened to those countries. They made the full transition to advanced nations in the period since then. So India has making a great leap. Another way to say this is that India achieved as much economic progress in 30 years as Great Britain did in 150 years. It's a very, very rapid pace of transformation. Now, one question that people ask, when you look at that Indian number and you look at those comparisons, you say, why does there still seem to be so much visible poverty in India if it's made. There appears to be more visible poverty, certainly, than there was in Japan in 1960. And the answer is one problem that you will have to deal with, which is a high degree of income inequality. India has a Gini coefficient, for those of you who do this sort of thing, of around 0.47. That's high. That's similar to someplace like Brazil, which is famous for high income inequality. Much of that is rural-urban, but there's also a high inequality within the urban areas. And so India has made enormous strides, but they're not very evenly distributed. And that is an issue that I know that people here are well aware of and will have to be dealt with future policy. But the progress is extraordinary. And of course, this is a very big country, which people have not at some level fully noticed. I was actually a little surprised, even doing the research for this talk myself, that more people haven't noticed that India is now, adjusting for purchasing power, is now the world's third largest economy. It has overtaken Japan. It is only the United States and China, or China and the United States, depends a little bit on your measurement, are bigger economies than India. It's far bigger than any European country. So this is an economic superpower by any normal standard in the world. It doesn't get full credit for it for, I think, a couple of reasons. One is that at market exchange rates, it's still substantially smaller than that, and that's a familiar issue. Market value, market price, GDP lags in poorer countries, so that from the point of view of somebody out to make money by selling, India is not quite as big as it really should be, but that will change over time. And the other is that the nature of India's export boom is one that has, I think, just been less visible, less, in some ways, good for you, less conspicuous in its disruption than the export boom from some other emerging markets. But this is an extraordinary achievement. Question you want to ask is, what's responsible for that extraordinary progress in India? And that's the first question you want to ask. The second question you want to ask is, can it continue? What are the reasons for optimism and pessimism? But which I think is probably the more important question. But let's just talk a bit about what changed. So clearly, there was a dramatic change in India's policy. The old self-sufficiency, inward-looking policy was changed. India now exports a large share of its GDP. It has moved to becoming a reasonably open economy, actually quite open considering the population. So the tariffs reduced dramatically. They were extremely high, now much reduced. Other forms of trade restriction eliminated. Also, a great deal of liberalization, probably even more important, liberalization within the domestic economy. As you presumably all know, from the point of view of U.S. politics, I'm on the center left, but that doesn't mean that I think that government should have a really heavy hand on the economy. India used to be, within my lifetime, even within my professional lifetime, used to be famous for the license Raj, where basically everything that was not specifically permitted was forbidden, and in which the bureaucratic obstacles to any kind of business were immense. That has not gone away completely, but is enormously reduced. And there have been a set of pro-business policies in general. India's overall thrust is still, perhaps, I'm sure that there are plenty of people in this room who will tell you things that they're upset about in terms of obstacles to doing business. But India has clearly become a much easier, much better place to do business than it was. I noticed last night the Prime Minister saying that India, in terms of ease of doing business, has moved up from number 148 to number 100. Being number 100 on that is not actually, that's not exactly a badge of distinction, but it's a lot better than it was, and it's a major improvement. India has also, by the way, moved up. One of the things that we still do talk about that was a big problem was infrastructure, and it still is, but it's better. Definite improvement on that criterion as well. So across the board, India has followed policies that have opened up the possibilities for doing business, have made it a very attractive place for international companies to do business. It's there, and it has been a real transformation of policy, and it came at a good time. There was a wave, if you like. There was a great a wave of globalization upon which countries with the right policies could surf. And India liberalized, India opened at the right time. So India's policy, and of course those goes both ways. India was witnessing changes in policies elsewhere. Indian policymakers were aware to at least some degree of the new opportunities, and so India was able to change its policies at just about the time that the world was becoming a much more friendly place for development, and took advantage. So what we have here is one of the great success stories of development so far, although still only up to a certain point. All of that said, India is different. And in some ways, India has done some things that are quite unique. Last I was able to check the numbers, India is now a major exporting country. Its exports of services are roughly comparable to its exports of manufactured goods. That's unprecedented. Nobody, certainly no large economy, has ever done that before. This is a new phenomenon in world economic history. It used to be that we just said services are not tradable. Services have to be provided locally. You cannot, aside from transport, nothing really can be exported as a service. That is no longer apparently the case, and above all, in terms of countries that have managed to do a lot of service exports, India takes the lead. And it's actually interesting. The other major exporters of services are basically in the business of providing financial services. So Britain is an exporter of services, but what we're really talking about is banking in the City of London. India, of course, is exporting a much wider range. Everything from outsourced IT, I mean, call centers is actually almost receding into the past, but was one of the first places where people became aware of it. But this is something new. It means that India has followed a very, although it's part of this great globalization wave, it has followed a different path from those of other developing countries. Instead of a manufacturing-centered entry into the world market, India has in large part had a service-centered excursion into the world market, which is something new, something different, and I think possibly, and as I'll explain in a couple of minutes, something that might work very much in India's favor as we look at the days ahead. All right. Back to the world economy for a moment here. There's a common myth that says that globalization always increases, that the integration of the world economy is a straight upward line, that trade always grows faster than income, that the world always becomes smaller. History tells you different. History says that, that globalization has come in waves that sometimes recede. So that we had an enormous increase in world trade between 1870 and 1913, but then it fell back relative to world income to about half what it had been. And that was partly because of wars, largely because of protectionism, a little bit because of technology. That's it. One not often understood point is that to have growing world trade, it's not enough to have improving transportation technology. Transportation technology has to improve faster than the technology of production. There's always a kind of a race between reducing costs by just producing things more cheaply here versus reducing costs by bringing stuff from abroad from countries that have lower costs of production. And as it turns out, for much of the 20th century, transportation technology was fairly static, whereas manufacturing was continuing to advance. You'll see why I'm mentioning that point in a few minutes. But in any case, what we saw was that world trade followed a great wave, a great increase in the late 19th and early 20th century, a great recessional, a backwards movement in world trade for 40 years, a recovery up to those pre-World War I levels by 1980 or so, and then this hyperglobalization that took place after 1990 or so. There are increasing reasons to believe that dramatic increase in world trade that we saw over a period of a little over 20 years was a one-time event, that it is not, in fact, something that you can count on to continue forever. You can see that in the numbers. World trade as a share of world GDP, it dropped during the recession and came back afterwards, but it has not resumed its upward march. World trade has been roughly static now for more than a decade as a share of world GDP. It looks like a plateau, not a downward turn, but a plateau. And if we ask why is that the case, the answer probably is that the technological opportunities were a one-time event. They were provided opportunities. Business learned to exploit those opportunities, but once you get there, you've gotten there. So we saw a tremendous increase in offshoring of production, tremendous increase in outsourcing to distant locations. By around 2010, we started to hear stories, see anecdotes, and a little bit of data suggesting that at least some manufacturing was discovering that it had gone a little too far in that direction. That even with very low transport costs, the logistical issues involved in shipping a good back and forth across the Pacific a few times in the course of production are not optimal. That it makes sense to reshore some production closer to markets. As you can see, some of that happening. In the United States, there's been this question, we've been seeing generally weak growth in wages across the board, except for a few skill categories where there has been clearly a very tight labor market for skilled workers with particular skills. And you ask, which are those skill categories? And they're not what you think. It's not actually that we're seeing big wage increases for software engineers. What we're actually seeing is big increases in wages for sewing machine operators. Because it turns out that at least some of the apparel industry has decided that it makes more sense to produce close to markets. And at this point in the United States, there's nobody left who knows how to sew clothing together. So we're kind of short on those sorts of people. And that's an indication. Yeah, it's a trivial story from the point of view of the economy as a whole, but I think it's an indicator that we're looking at a situation where this great increase in globalization that we saw may have reached its limits. Doesn't mean a big downturn in world trade, but it does mean that there's this great wave that was driving a lot of change in the world economy has probably crested, has probably reached its limit, with one big exception, which we'll get to in a minute. So here we are, and we're looking at the story now. And I think I should say that limits of globalization, that is a concern for some economies. It may be a concern for India at a certain point. Again, I'll get there in a few minutes. But it does mean that, to a certain extent, as new countries try to enter this sphere, they are going to be competing over a somewhat limited pool of business. It's a far bigger pool of business than we ever imagined possible. We used to think that labor-intensive exports were basically apparel and nothing much else. Now we know that there are labor-intensive stages of production for many goods, and so there's a lot of stuff that's available. But if I were thinking about the future for Vietnam or Bangladesh, or possibly as some of the sub-Saharan African nations start to break in, I would be at least a little bit concerned that they missed the moment of the explosion of globalization. And so there's a little bit of a concern there. But that's an important issue, but not at least so far yet, a very India-specific issue. But then that brings me to the Indian prospects. So let me give you 3 reasons for being optimistic. I think I'm obliged simply by the title of the summit to be optimistic here. So let me give you, but I actually am mostly, with some qualifications, quite optimistic about India's prospects. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more, and I think over time, when the world thinks about rising powers, it will be shifting its focus increasingly to India, at least a little bit away from China, which has been the lead story so far. The first one is people, both numbers and qualifications. So one of the panelists yesterday said India has a lot of smart people, and it does. There's clearly a cultural reservoir of creativity, entrepreneurship, on a level that I think back in the bad old days of slow Indian growth, no one could have imagined, but that's clearly there. And look, the widespread fluency in English is an important thing, even as the United States gradually loses its preeminent status. Nonetheless, English is the language of global commerce, and that's got to matter. But also, there's just plain numbers. If you try to think about national economic destinies, it matters a lot how many people of working age you have. If we're trying to analyze, we talk now, there was a time, I'm old enough to remember it, when Japan was about to become the world's leading economic superpower, which obviously never did happen. And it didn't happen for a couple of reasons. One was that the Japanese rapid productivity growth slowed down, that Japanese technological progress didn't stop, but no longer seemed to be unstoppable. But the biggest reason why Japan has receded on the world stage is simply demography. Japan, with very low fertility rates, cultural aversion to immigration. Japan has a working age population which is now shrinking at about 1.5% a year. And so even if you actually adjust for that, Japan's economic performance the past 20 years doesn't look too bad. But it's a declining factor on the world scene simply because there aren't enough Japanese. Believe it or not, China is starting to look a little bit like that. China's working age population appears to have just about peaked now and will be headed downwards in future. And that's a legacy of the one-child policy, various other factors, but China is not going to continue, it cannot continue to grow at the pace it did simply because of population. Plus, I would say in the case of China, a lot of their growth came from taking people from a backwards agricultural sector and moving them into the modern urban sector, and that process has probably reached its limits, so China has reached that point. India doesn't look at all like that. India's working age population is projected to grow substantially. It will substantially exceed China's working age population in just a few years, and will continue growing for quite some time, which is potentially a source of a lot of economic growth. One good way to have an economic superpower is to have a lot of people working productively, and India certainly has a lot of people. So that's a very, very important possibility. Of course, you have to find jobs for those people, and that's going to be one of the issues that we need to worry about a little bit. Come to that in a bit. But assuming that that can work, India has the demography is on India's side in terms of its future economic role in the world. Second source of optimism is simply that India is still quite poor, still quite far behind the technological cutting edge, which is not a good thing, but means that the opportunity for catch-up is still there. I mean, you cannot expect to have the kind of growth that emerging Asia has had if you're already at the technological frontier, which is why Japan, it can no longer be a country of rapid growth. But India is still, so much of India is still far behind, and of course, particularly if we look at rural areas. I was struck again by the Prime Minister's speech talking about rural electrification. That's not, believe it or not, that's not ancient history even in wealthy countries. If we go back to the United States, one of the major projects of Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal in the 1930s, was rural electrification. Because in the 1930s, most of rural America did not have electric power. So we're now talking about, but the point is that you have the opportunity now to bring hundreds of millions of people into the modern world, and that in turn means that there's a tremendous source of growth, potential at least, that is not available for countries that have already done that. So that's a source of forward motion. The third source of optimism is the distinctiveness of India's role in global trade. As I said, India, it's completely unique and unprecedented to be as much of a service exporter as India now is. Up until the rise of India, all of the success stories in the developing world have been based around manufactured exports. And that's a good thing, nothing wrong with that. In fact, India needs to do more of that. I'll say more in a sec. But for the first time, we started to see large-scale exports of services from a developing country. That is, if we ask why did that become possible, and the answer is information technology, the internet. That is clearly something that there are just many things that used to be impossible to provide except on a very local basis that can now be outsourced to long distances. So the opportunity arose to start doing that, and it starts with relatively low-tech stuff like call centers, moves on to all kinds of information technology, other services. India got a head start. India began doing that before anybody else. Does it on a scale that nobody else can match. The widespread, again, use of English helps on that. This base of very smart people who understand information technology help on that. I would suspect, by the way, that India has a a potential, it's already happening, you have a potential base at the very highest level of people simply coming back from Silicon Valley to do enterprise here. So you have that as well. Now, why is that important? Why is that a special Indian advantage? The kind of hyperglobalization that we have mostly seen so far has involved manufactured goods. And the technologies that enable that, containerization, communication, have probably pretty much been fully exploited. The possibilities of service globalization have only just begun. We're only just in the very earliest stages of finding ways to deliver services remotely. And so there, whatever I may have said about hyperglobalization having been a one-time event, the globalization of service trade is still something that is probably mostly in the future. So India starts from an export mix that happens to be especially well suited to the next stage of globalization. That's a reason to be especially hopeful about Indian prospects. I don't think we're not going to see that happening. There will be a few other places that may be able to take pieces of that. We hope there are. You can see beginnings of something like an Indian-style service export sector in the Philippines, for example, and for some of the same reasons, actually. But India has kind of a first-mover advantage in the globalization of services, and that's an appealing prospect. Now, one thing to say about that is what we do not yet see is whether service exporting can provide employment on the scale that India needs. And when we talk about demography, it's funny, I've been reading a lot about India's demographic position, and everyone agrees on the fact there's going to be a dramatic increase in the working age population in India at the same time that other countries are seeing a big stagnation or decline in working age population. But half of the stories on it say, what a tremendous opportunity for India to become the global economic superpower. The other half of the stories say, what a catastrophe, we'll never find jobs for all those people. We're talking about mass unemployment. And both of those are possible stories. So India needs to find a way to employ this vast population. It cannot, it is a densely populated country. They're not going to be employed in agriculture. So we need to be talking about growth in other sectors. And probably, despite what I've said about the advantages from the service export focus, India needs to get much more into the global manufacturing game as well. And there really doesn't seem to be any good reason why that shouldn't be possible, but it's going to be necessary. India, in a way, having done something which was unprecedented, which is to diversify into service exports in a way that nobody has done. In a way, India now needs to diversify back into manufacturing as well in order to provide the kind of job growth it needs to make use of all of the people who will be coming available. So that's that is a question. But I still think that the unique nature of India's export boom does put it in a favorable position relative to other emerging markets in the decades ahead. Okay, let's talk about reasons for concern. So one very broad, there's a now widely observed phenomenon. I started by talking about how depressing it was to look at development economics 40 years ago because there were no success stories. And since then, there have been many success stories, China and India being the two most dramatic, but quite a few other success stories. However, there have now been enough success stories that we're starting to get some pictures of the limits of success as well. And there's a now quite well documented phenomenon called the middle income trap. By the way, it's a great privilege. You should be wildly encouraged that India has reached the point where we can now start to talk about the middle income trap. You have to make a lot of progress before you get to that point. But it turns out that it's quite common for countries to grow quite rapidly up until they reach, it varies, 20%, 50% of the per capita income of the wealthiest countries. And then they kind of stagnate, or at least slow down dramatically at that point. They don't seem to be able to close that last gap between themselves and Northwest Europe or the United States. And what's that about? I mean, it's a statistical observation. What's it about? And the answer, as best we can tell, this is somewhat speculative, but we think what we see, is that institutional problems, institutional failures that are tolerable when you're still a poor, low-wage country start to become bigger obstacles once you no longer are in that position. Once you can no longer compete simply by being much cheaper as a production location in other places, you start to in a way, the future economic progress requires a quality of institutions that is higher. You need to get better at some things, and that can include a wide variety of things. It can include issues of corruption. You can have a very corrupt economy, which, as long as the corruption doesn't totally prevent business from being done, and it has low wages, it can still grow very rapidly. But at a certain point, let's put you can't become Denmark with Chinese levels of corruption, right? You can't. You have to clean up your act in order to be able to really compete at the highest levels. Government, efficient, effective government, including efficient provision of government services. Again, it doesn't have to be all that great at lower levels of development, but it needs to get much better. Banking. The banking system the banking system doesn't have to be great when companies can largely finance themselves through reinvestment of profits, or when the investment opportunities are so large that even a not very effective banking system can do the job. You need to get a lot better at that in order to be able to close that final hurdle. And so you all know India far better than I do, but it's not hard to see that India needs a lot of institutional progress, needs to go a long way to get up to the kind of performance that one sees in the most advanced countries. And that means that India is potentially susceptible to running into this middle income trap. Okay, I see I'm hitting limit here, but let me just say two things that may come as surprises to you in terms of threats. One is artificial intelligence. I mentioned that there's kind of a race between transportation costs and productivity in trade and goods. We're now starting to see in services that there's a little bit of a race between globalization and AI. Suppose that you want to get interpretation of medical data. Tests are performed on somebody in New York. They can be interpreted, well, they could be interpreted by somebody here who's paid a third the wage of the comparable person in the US, or they could be interpreted by an expert system. So you can outsource it to India, or you can outsource it to cyberspace. And there is something of an issue here. There's a possibility that some of these service opportunities will be foreclosed by AI. I won't say very much more about that, except to say that something is there's fantastic stuff happening on both fronts, but we don't know. There is some competition there. And finally, let me just say that the advanced countries are a mess. And although emerging markets have been moving forward, the advanced countries are still very troubled economies. We're over the worst of the Great Recession, but not for very much. In the United States, we have recovered, we have full employment, but we have interest rates that are still barely above zero. We have no shock absorbers in our system. So if something goes wrong, we have no good way to respond to it. Europe is still not fully recovered. We're still very, very vulnerable in the advanced countries. This open world trading system that has been so crucial to the progress of developing countries is obviously under threat. Populism is on the rise politically all across the advanced world. In addition to systematic populist backlash, you also just want to include the possibility of just plain irrational policy, lashing out. There's no guarantee, it turns out, that even in the most advanced countries, people who have no idea what they're doing may end up in charge of economic policy. I wonder what country I have in mind. Anyway, but the global system is under some risk, and that poses a threat. But let me just end by saying the story so far of India is wildly, wildly encouraging. If someone had told me 40 years ago that India would look now the way it does, that India's prospects would have looked the way they do, I would have said, you're dreaming. If the person had been Indian, I would have said your patriotism is leading you into bizarre optimism. In fact, it's a marvelous, incredible story, and probably the future looks even brighter than the past does. Thank you all very much.